While Berta was brewing tea, someone knocked on the door, sharp and impatient, rattling the walls. The sound carried through the house, cutting into the quiet like a blade. She set the cup down, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward the door, already sensing something was wrong. As soon as she opened it, a brutal force slammed into her stomach, knocking the air from her lungs, folding her body in half. Pain flared sharp and immediate, radiating through her ribs. Footsteps retreated down the porch, fading into the night, but she barely heard them over the ringing in her ears. Cold sweat broke out along her spine. She clutched the door frame, steadying herself, swallowing the nausea rising in her throat. The room tilted, then righted itself as she forced herself to stand. From the hallway, Ruby watched. Her fingers curled into a fist, nails digging into her palm. She had seen this before, the violence wrapped in silence, the kind that left no witnesses, only warnings. Her gaze swept over the street, scanning the shadows between the neat, uniform houses. Somewhere, behind one of those perfectly trimmed hedges, behind those white picket fences and glowing porch lights, someone was watching. They always were. The first days in the neighborhood had been tense, but manageable. The smiles had been too wide, the greetings too rehearsed, the polite distance too deliberate. The first real sign had come a week later, a flat tire, then another. A piece of glass scattered across the driveway. A garbage bag, torn open, its contents strewn across the porch. Then, the mailbox incident. A severed slab of raw meat, blood dripping through the cracks of the wooden frame, staining the front steps. A message, clear and deliberate. They had seen it before. Two black women, moving into a place where they weren't supposed to be. Their very presence was enough to unsettle the order, disrupt the silent rules these streets operated by. It was always the same. First the whispers, then the warnings, and if that didn't work, the violence followed. Berta pulled herself upright, one hand pressed against her stomach, breathing through the pain. The words on the wall behind her were fresh, still dripping in uneven streaks. Get out. A demand, a command, scrawled in bold red letters, bleeding down the white paint like an open wound. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken but unmistakable. Ruby knew how this worked. The neighbors wouldn't say a word. They'd smile in the daylight, act as if nothing had happened, pretend they didn't see a thing. But at night, the same hands that held garden shears and leashes and coffee cups turned into fists, into knives, into paint cans dripping threats onto walls. Berta exhaled, slow and deliberate, shoulders straightening. The pain was still there, a deep, lingering ache, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what happened next. Ruby's gaze lingered on the words staining their house, the crude lines meant to push them out, break them down. A familiar fire burned in her chest. They weren't going anywhere. They saw the flash of fire in the window before they smelled the smoke, a sudden explosion of orange and red against the night. The neighbor's car was in flames, and the fire was crawling hungrily toward the house, licking at the wooden panels, consuming the air with its thick, suffocating heat. For a second, no one moved, no one spoke. The street bathed in flickering light, shadows twisting against the pavement, the silence stretching with the weight of hesitation. Then Ruby was running, legs pounding against the ground, instincts overriding thought, her hands grabbing the first thing she could find, a rusted metal bucket left near the porch. She barely registered the sting in her arms as she hauled it toward the fire, the water sloshing violently against the sides, spilling over her wrists. "Berta, hose," she shouted, her voice sharp, urgent, cutting through the stillness, and behind her, she could hear movement, a door slamming open, hurried steps across the yard. She didn't think about the fact that the people in that house had spent the last 2 weeks trying to drive them out, had thrown their trash onto their lawn, had whispered threats through the cracks in their white picket fences. She didn't think about the way their eyes had glowed with cold satisfaction every time they found another tire slashed, another message carved into their mailbox. All she saw now was fire, spreading, threatening to take down a home, and she knew no one else was going to act. The water from the bucket hit the flames with a hiss, evaporating almost instantly, the heat relentless, pushing back against her efforts like a living thing. A blast of sparks shot into the air as the flames leapt higher, and Ruby stumbled back, shielding her face, her lungs already burning from the thickening smoke. Then, finally, she heard it, the rush of water, the heavy drag of the hose being pulled across the yard, and Berta was there, her jaw tight, her stance unwavering as she aimed the stream at the base of the fire, her hands steady despite the tremors in her arms. The neighbors stood frozen in their doorways, watching, their faces illuminated by the glow, but none of them moved to help, none of them stepped forward. Some of them had likely seen who threw that bottle, had known this was coming, had heard the glass shatter against metal and done nothing. The fire hissed, buckling under the assault of water, smoke rising in thick plumes as the orange glow dimmed, swallowed by the wet pavement and the relentless pressure of the hose. The car was ruined, its metal frame warped, blackened, the windows melted into jagged shards. The house was safe, untouched except for the soot-streaked siding and the faint scorch marks near the porch. It was only when the last ember died that Ruby turned, her eyes sweeping over the gathering crowd, their silence heavier than the smoke lingering in the air. The police arrived 30 minutes later, their sirens useless, their expressions blank. They took one look at the smoldering remains of the car, then turned to Ruby and Berta, their questions flat, their words sharp with suspicion rather than concern. What were they doing outside this late? Had they seen anything? Did they have any enemies? The implication was clear, settling into the air like ash. Berta wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her fingers still damp from the hose, her gaze locked on the officer standing too close, his badge gleaming under the streetlight. She knew this routine. It was never about justice, never about protection. It was about control, about power, about reminding them that they didn't belong, that even now, even after they had stopped a fire from spreading through their neighborhood, they were still the ones under suspicion. By the time the cops left, the street had emptied. The neighbors had retreated into their homes, doors clicking shut, curtains swaying as they stole glances through their windows. No one thanked them. No one asked if they were okay. The next morning, Ruby opened the mailbox and stopped. A single photograph lay inside, glossy, freshly printed, her own face staring back at her, captured from the night before, caught mid-motion, smoke curling around her silhouette, the fire reflected in her eyes. Beneath it, in thick black ink, a message scrawled across the bottom. "You're next." They thought they could scare us, force us out, make us disappear into the night like we had never existed. They thought a few threats, a little violence, a fire set under the cover of darkness would be enough to make us run. They were wrong. When the sun rose over this quiet, manicured neighborhood, it lit up the truth. Plastered across every mailbox, every lamppost, every neatly trimmed hedge were the faces of the men who had tried to burn us out. Caught in the act, frozen in the glare of the flames, their sneers immortalized by the security cameras we had set up. Beneath each photo, the message was simple, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "They hide among you." Berta had barely spoken since we found that photograph in the mailbox, the one with the words, "You're next," slashed across the bottom in thick black ink. She didn't need to. The tension in her shoulders, the way her hands curled into fists at her sides, the tight set of her jaw, she was done being quiet. This was no longer about warnings. This was war. The night before, we had moved in silence, working quickly under the cover of darkness. The security cameras we had installed were no longer just for show, no longer just for peace of mind. Every angle was covered, every blind spot eliminated. The motion sensors were checked, double-checked, positioned so that nothing and no one could move unseen. We sat in the dark, waiting. The cowards came just before dawn, slinking through the streets like rats, their movements sharp, purposeful, routine. A switchblade glinting under the streetlight, a can of spray paint shaking softly in the still air, their low chuckles muffled beneath their hoods. They thought they were untouchable, unseen. The cameras caught everything. The sneers on their faces, the tattoos on their wrists, the way they glanced over their shoulders like they knew, deep down, that something was watching. We waited until they were gone before we moved. Every image, every frame was printed, copied, multiplied. Before the rest of the neighborhood had even poured their morning coffee, their streets were papered with the evidence. We watched from our porch as people stumbled out of their houses, blinking against the sunlight, clutching the papers in their hands like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The fear was tangible, stretching across lawns and driveways, weaving through the whispered conversations between neighbors. They weren't afraid for us. They were afraid for themselves. Because now they knew we weren't the only ones watching. The silence stretched throughout the day, heavy and suffocating. No one knocked on our door. No one came to rip the papers down. No one dared. But we knew the quiet wouldn't last. That night it came. A rustling outside, the soft scrape of something sliding beneath the front door. A note, folded in half, ink smudged where the writer's hand had pressed too hard. I bent down, picked it up, let the weight of it settle in my palm before I unfolded it. The words were uneven, jagged, the ink pressed deep into the paper as if each letter had been carved instead of written. "They'll bury you in this town." I stared at it for a long moment, my heartbeat steady, my breath slow. It wasn't fear that settled in my chest. It was something colder, sharper, something that had been waiting to surface. Berta stepped into the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floor. She didn't ask what it said. She didn't need to. Her eyes flickered down to the paper in my hand, then to the knife on the counter, the one she picked up without hesitation. The blade caught the dim light, reflecting it back in a thin, silver gleam. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Let them try." When Berta spotted the flash of lights beyond the fence, she didn't hesitate. Her body moved before thought could catch up, instincts honed by decades of knowing what it meant to be hunted, knowing what it meant to stand on the wrong side of a system that had never been built for them. She reached under the couch, fingers curling around cold steel, lifted the weight of the pump-action shotgun with the ease of someone who had carried it before, felt the familiar press of wood against her shoulder as she stepped toward the window. The darkness outside was shifting, shadows slithering between trees, figures lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlights. A click echoed through the silence as she chambered around, the sound slicing through the air like a warning. Then, without pause, without ceremony, she pulled the trigger. The explosion shattered the stillness, a deafening roar ripping through the night, followed by the sharp, panicked yells of men scrambling for cover. Footsteps pounded against pavement, branches snapped under hurried movements, bodies ducked and disappeared into the black. They thought they were hunters. They thought they were predators. But now they were prey. Ruby stood at the door, watching, her fingers tight around the handle of the knife she had pulled from the kitchen drawer. The cold weight pressed into her palm, grounding her, keeping her steady. They had been waiting for this. The cameras had caught them the night before, their grainy faces barely visible under the hoods they wore, the slow, deliberate way they moved, testing doors, checking windows, marking territory that didn't belong to them. They had been planning something, creeping closer with each passing night, feeding off the silence, emboldened by the lack of consequences. They thought this house was just another target. They didn't think two old women would fight back. Another mistake. The street fell into silence again, thick with tension, the acrid scent of gunpowder still clinging to the air. No sirens. No flashing red and blue lights. No one coming to investigate. The cops weren't interested in this fight. They never were. Morning brought no relief, only more questions. No one mentioned the gunshot. No one asked why a pack of men had been seen running for their lives through the neighborhood in the middle of the night. But the air had changed. The neighbors who had spent weeks pretending not to notice the threats, the vandalism, the violence now looked uneasy, shifting glances, nervous hands gripping coffee mugs too tightly on front porches. They had all seen the flyers. They had all seen the proof. Now they had heard the sound of resistance, the sound of two women refusing to be easy targets, and it left them unsettled. The silence didn't last. It never did. The next attack came swift and indiscriminate, no longer a whisper but a declaration. Windows shattered on Elm Street. Cars were keyed, their tires slashed. Someone's dog was found poisoned in their backyard. What had started as a focused effort to push Ruby and Berta out was evolving, spreading like infection, turning on the very people who had watched in silence, who had let it happen because they thought it didn't concern them. For the first time, a knock came at the door that wasn't a threat. A man stood on the porch, his face pale, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he wasn't sure if he should be here. He wasn't a friend. He had never spoken to them before. But his eyes flicked toward the bullet holes in the fence, Then back to them, his throat working around the words before he finally asked, voice hoarse and uncertain. What do we do now? A gunshot tore through the night, the sharp crack of metal meeting flesh echoing down the empty streets. The man staggered, clutching his leg, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he collapsed onto the pavement, his weapon slipping from his grasp. The others froze, eyes darting toward the rooftops, the alleyways, the windows that had once been blind but now gleamed with quiet, watchful fury. They thought they had won. They thought this neighborhood belonged to them. They didn't know that tonight, they weren't the only ones fighting for it. The chaos had started hours earlier, the first brick shattering glass, sending a cascade of sharp edges onto the sidewalk. Then came the fires, bright and hungry, devouring the insides of stores, licking at the doors of homes. The screams followed, muffled behind locked doors, behind curtains that had once shielded only secrets but now concealed fear. The gang moved through the streets like a storm, tearing through everything in their path, emboldened by the silence of law enforcement, by the knowledge that no sirens would wail, no police would arrive, no one in power would lift a hand to stop them. For too long, the neighborhood had watched from behind closed doors, hoping the storm would pass them by, praying that if they remained still, if they remained quiet, they wouldn't be next. But silence had never saved anyone. It only made the wolves hungrier. Berta and Ruby had seen enough. They moved through the town like ghosts, slipping through alleyways, knocking on doors, whispering into ears that had once ignored them, into the minds of those who had convinced themselves that this wasn't their fight. One by one, the residents emerged from their homes, faces grim, hands gripping baseball bats, knives, old hunting rifles that had gathered dust in attics. The fear was still there, heavy and thick, but it had been joined by something else, rage. By midnight, the patrols had begun. No longer was this a town of passive victims. Every intersection had eyes, every alley had a shadow waiting to strike. The streets that had once belonged to the gang were no longer theirs to roam freely. The second attack came just before dawn. A truck rolled in, headlights off, bodies spilling out like rats from a sinking ship. They spread out, moving fast, smashing windows, prying at doors, searching for easy prey. They didn't realize that the rules had changed. The first shot rang out from a rooftop, a warning. The second was not. The gang scattered, instincts kicking in, but they had lost the advantage of surprise. A woman stepped out from behind a car, shotgun steady in her grip. A man blocked their path at the alley, a crowbar hanging loose at his side. Every exit was closed, every street corner a trap. The injured man writhed on the ground, his screams swallowed by the night. His crew hesitated, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, between the rules they had lived by and the reality they now faced. Then someone shouted a single word, "Run." They ran. Boots pounded against pavement, bodies slammed into fences, desperate hands clawed for escape. The neighborhood they had terrorized had turned against them, and they had no choice but to flee. The fires still burned, the glass still glittered like broken stars against the concrete, but the streets no longer belonged to the gang. They belonged to the people who had decided that fear was no longer an option. The truck rolled in slow, its engine growling low against the quiet night, its headlights slicing through the smoke still hanging in the air from the fires set the night before. The gang had retreated but not broken, licking their wounds, planning their retaliation, convinced that this town was still theirs to take. They came armed this time, packed tight in the back like a militia, hands gripping steel pipes, chains, sawed-off shotguns, waiting for the order to spill out and finish what they had started. But as they turned onto the main street, their momentum slowed. The road was no longer theirs to claim. The barricades stood tall, made from overturned cars, broken fences, dumpsters dragged from alleyways, debris from shattered storefronts stacked high like fortress walls. Behind them, waiting, were the people they had underestimated, the people they thought would cower, the people who had decided that enough was enough. And standing at the center of it all, feet planted firmly, arms crossed over her chest, was Berta. She stared them down, unmoved, unshaken, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Welcome to hell." The truck lurched to a stop, hesitation rippling through the gang like a wave. They had expected fear, submission, easy prey. Instead, they found an army. From windows above, from rooftops, from alleyways, the town had risen, weapons clenched, bodies tensed, ready for war. The gang's leader stepped down, his boots crunching against the pavement, eyes scanning the blockade, calculating, searching for weakness. He didn't see one. What he did see was Ruby, standing atop a burned-out car, the flickering light of the fires dancing against the glass bottle in her hand. The liquid inside sloshed with each slow, deliberate movement. A rag dangled from its mouth, soaked, waiting. Her fingers tightened around a lighter, her voice steady, final. Someone's burning tonight. And it won't be us. A single second stretched into eternity, thick with unspoken threats, the charged air between them ready to explode. The gang leader exhaled sharply, tilted his head as if weighing his options. Then the first shot rang out. It wasn't clear who fired first, whether it was a warning or a mistake, but it didn't matter. The street erupted into chaos. The truck reversed, its tires screeching against the pavement as its driver panicked, trying to escape the war zone that had once been an open road. Gunfire cracked through the night, bullets burying themselves in barricades, ricocheting off metal. The town fought back, unrelenting. Molotovs sailed through the air, their impact blooming into waves of heat, licking at the edges of the battlefield. A gang member screamed as fire caught his sleeve, dropping his weapon, rolling against the pavement in desperate attempts to smother the flames. Others ran, scattering like rats, realizing too late that they had stepped into a trap. The barricades held. The people didn't break. The gang had come expecting an easy slaughter, but they found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, driven back by the very ones they had sought to destroy. A bat swung, cracking against ribs. A rifle fired, sending another man crumbling to the ground. Someone's shotgun blasted into the air, not aiming to kill, just to terrify, and it worked. Fear surged through the ranks of the attackers, their confidence splintering. They had never faced resistance like this. This wasn't a town of victims anymore. The retreat was fast, desperate. The gang fled, abandoning their own, climbing over each other in their rush to escape. The truck screeched around the corner, its driver ducking low as rocks and bricks pelted the windshield, shattering glass, forcing them to veer off the road. The last of them disappeared into the night, leaving behind the wounded, the broken, the lost. The battle was over. The town still stood. By the time the police arrived, the streets were quiet again, save for the flicker of dying flames, the whispers of victory carried on the wind. They moved cautiously, their hands hovering over their holsters, their gazes sweeping over the battered remains of the fight, over the blood smeared on the pavement, over the people standing unshaken, their weapons still in their hands. They had come too late. And now, no one needed them. The next morning, the world knew their names. Newspapers sprawled across coffee shop tables, headlines screamed from television screens, news anchors spoke their names with something between admiration and disbelief. Retired women exposed corruption. The grandmothers who fought back. They took on the system, and won. The photos spread like wildfire, Ruby standing at the barricades, firelight flickering in her eyes, Berta gripping her shotgun like she had never planned to let it go. Somewhere, a video had leaked, a shaky, grainy clip capturing the gang scattering like insects, the police arriving too late, the people standing tall. The world wanted a story, and now they had one. Two black women who had refused to break, had refused to run, had done what no one else had dared to do. The mayor called an emergency press conference, his face taut, his voice measured, feeding the public the words they expected to hear. We are investigating all reports of negligence, misconduct, and corruption within the police force. The cameras flashed, microphones extended, the press hungry for a scapegoat, for answers. But the people in this town already knew the truth. The cops had ignored the calls. The cops had let it happen. The mayor had let it happen. They had smiled at the gangsters in the daylight and taken their money in the dark. Names were named, bribes exposed, meetings recorded, the tangled web of backdoor deals unraveling in real time. Investigations began. Careers ended. The walls they had built around themselves, the protections they had thought untouchable, crumbled. At first, the reporters swarmed the government buildings, the police stations, the offices of men who suddenly had nothing to say. But soon enough, they came for Ruby and Berta. Cameras lined the sidewalks, flashes popping, microphones thrust forward with eager, breathless voices. How did you do it? What do you have to say to the people watching? What's next for you? Berta leaned against the porch railing, watching them from above, sipping her coffee, her expression unreadable. Ruby didn't bother looking up from her seat, fingers curled around the warm ceramic of her tea mug, letting the steam rise, breathing it in. They had no interest in the spectacle. They had done what needed to be done. They had fought because no one else would. The news trucks didn't leave. The world wanted more. They were invited to speak on morning shows, to sit across from men in tailored suits who wanted to ask the same rehearsed questions. Offers rolled in, book deals, interviews, even a ridiculous suggestion about a documentary. They turned them all down. The town, once filled with whispered warnings and passive glances, now looked at them differently. Some people smiled at them in the grocery store, awkward, uncertain. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Fear still lingered in some, but there was something else, something new. Respect. The last of the gang had fled. The cops who had lined their pockets were gone, some resigning, others being pulled into investigations that would drag their names through the mud. The ones who remained patrolled differently now, more aware that they were being watched, that their silence no longer gave them protection. One afternoon, a small group of neighbors hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, shifting awkwardly, clearing their throats, until finally one of them, a man who had once looked the other way when the threats had started, spoke. "Thank you." Berta tilted her head, giving him a long, unreadable look. "For what?" He swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. "For not leaving." Ruby finally looked up from her tea, eyes sharp, voice calm. "We were never going to." The reporters still lingered outside, but their presence had become background noise, no different from the rustling of leaves or the distant sound of car engines. They weren't waiting for answers anymore. They were waiting for the next chapter. But Ruby and Berta weren't interested in giving them one. That evening, as the sun set in a wash of deep orange and purple, they sat side by side on the porch, letting the weight of it all settle. Berta chuckled, shaking her head, glancing at the newspaper folded beside her. Did we just become famous? Ruby took a slow sip of her tea, exhaling, watching a group of kids run down the street, laughing, playing without fear. When Ruby and Berta entered the police station, the entire room fell into a suffocating silence. The usual hum of ringing phones, rustling papers, and murmured conversations evaporated as officers turned to look, their gazes wary, their bodies stiffening as if sensing the shift in power before it was fully understood. They had ruled this town for too long, controlling its people with intimidation, dismissing their fears, pocketing bribes, turning away when criminals moved through the streets unchecked. They had thought the storm had passed, that whatever rebellion had stirred in the people would settle now that the gang was gone. But Ruby and Berta had not come for half a victory. They had come to expose the rest of the rot. One officer's hand twitched toward his holster, fingers brushing against the grip of his pistol, instincts conditioned for aggression rather than accountability. He wasn't ready for the quiet steel in Ruby's expression, the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with something closer to amusement, as if daring him to make a move he wouldn't live down. The weight of the moment pressed heavy against the walls, against the air itself, and as the officer's hand fell back to his side, the unspoken truth settled across the room. The real threat wasn't outside on the streets anymore. It was standing in front of them, two women who had seen the system fail for too long, two women who weren't leaving without answers. The folder landed on the counter with a dull slap, its thick edges bending under the weight of its contents. Photographs spilled onto the surface, timestamps and transaction receipts laid bare, pieces of a puzzle no longer obscured by bureaucracy or silence. The hidden cameras set up in alleyways, in blind spots no one had thought to check, had captured everything. Officers meeting with gang members under the cover of night, envelopes exchanged, backdoor deals cut in whispers, stolen weapons transported in unmarked police vehicles. There was no plausible deniability left. Every blurred line had been sharpened, every secret dragged into the light. The officers who had stood by and watched as the gang terrorized the town, who had let the fire burn because they had been paid to look the other way, now found their faces staring back at them from the damning evidence laid bare for all to see. No one spoke. The air had changed, thick with tension, with the understanding that there was no clean escape from this. Some of the officers shifted their weight, their gazes darting toward the captain's office, toward the exits, toward the places where power had always been protected. But there was no protection left. The silence wasn't just fear, it was calculation, the slow, dawning realization that the tide had turned, and they were now the ones under scrutiny. The chain of command would not shield them from what was coming. Berta reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and with a flick of her finger, set the final act in motion. The sirens that followed weren't the usual kind, not the controlled response of a force that had dictated when and where justice was served. These were the sirens of the press, of cameras rolling, of questions forming that had no good answers. The news vans lined up outside in minutes, reporters stepping onto the pavement with microphones gripped tightly, earpieces humming as they prepared to broadcast the truth in real time. The people watching from their homes, from their workplaces, from the very streets that had suffered under this corruption, were about to see what had been hidden for so long. The captain burst into the lobby, his face twisted with barely restrained rage, his authority faltering under the weight of exposure. This was not a confrontation he had been prepared for. The old rules didn't apply anymore. His voice barked orders, his words were sharp with indignation, but there was no force behind them, no control left to wield. The eyes of his own officers flickered with doubt, their shifting postures revealing the fractures spreading through the very institution they had relied on to shield them from consequences. Outside, the cameras continued rolling. Inside, the unraveling had begun. When their names were called, the city fell silent. Thousands of people gathered in the square, faces turned toward the stage, the same streets that had once whispered their names now chanting them. Two women who had been nothing more than shadows in a neighborhood that didn't want them now stood as the reason it still stood at all. The microphone crackled as Ruby adjusted her glasses, scanning the crowd, her gaze settling on the familiar faces of those who had once looked away, of those who had once been too afraid to act. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, not with fear, not with pride, but with the heavy truth of what had been done. They had fought. They had won. But they had never been the ones who should have had to fight in the first place. The fallout from the police station had been swift and ruthless. The evidence, too damning to ignore, too detailed to be dismissed, had cracked open decades of corruption, spilling secrets into the light. Officers had been arrested, some dragged from their homes in the early hours of the morning, their badges ripped from their chests, their faces plastered across news broadcasts with the same weight of guilt they had once ignored in others. The mayor, once smug and untouchable, had resigned within days, his statement a pathetic attempt at control, his words drowned out by the relentless demands for justice. The city had turned against its own protectors, because they had never been protectors at all. And through it all, Ruby and Berta had watched from their porch, knowing this was only the beginning. The new officials, desperate to rewrite the narrative, to mend what had been broken, had reached out, offering medals, commendations, public acknowledgments of bravery. They had smiled too wide, spoken too carefully, their voices dripping with the same politics that had once left them abandoned. Ruby and Berta had refused. They weren't interested in rewards, in ceremonies where men in suits pretended to understand the weight of what had been done. Justice was never meant to be rewarded. It was meant to be expected. And yet, the people had insisted on something. Not an award, not another empty gesture, but a gathering, a moment of recognition not from the leaders who had failed them but from the community itself. And so the stage had been built, the square filled, the air thick with something neither of them could quite name. Gratitude. Respect. Atonement. Ruby exhaled, her grip tightening around the microphone, the weight of thousands of eyes pressing against her, waiting, listening, hoping. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, with rehearsed words meant to inspire. She spoke the truth, because it was the only thing she had ever known. We didn't fight for ourselves. We fought for all of you. And if it took two old women to do it, then something is very wrong with this town. The silence held for only a moment before the applause erupted, rolling through the crowd like a wave, like thunder, a force that neither of them had ever expected to hear in their name. The speeches ended. The crowd lingered, unwilling to let go of the moment, unwilling to return to a world where their protectors had failed them. But for Ruby and Berta, the fight was already over. They returned home as they always had, walking side by side down the same streets that had once wished them gone. That night, as the city settled, as the weight of change settled onto its people, Berta pulled an old gramophone onto the porch, the scratches on its surface a reminder of the years it had survived, of the music it still held. The needle dropped, the soft crackle of vinyl filling the air before the melody took over, rich and warm, spilling into the streets. Children ran past, their laughter uninhibited, their footsteps light against the pavement. People strolled without fear, heads high, shoulders no longer hunched in expectation of something worse. The world had shifted, not in grand gestures, not in promises from men in power, but in the simple truth that the people had reclaimed what had once been taken from them. Ruby watched it unfold, the quiet aftermath of a war no one had expected them to win. She turned to Berta, her voice low, thoughtful. "You think that was our last fight?" Berta smiled, slow and knowing, eyes gleaming under the dim glow of the porch light. "Baby, we're just getting started."